There's a subtle dynamic that unfolds whenever an empath walks into a room, and most people don't consciously recognize it, but they feel it. An empath's presence is not just about kindness or warmth, it's about clarity. It's about emotional transparency. And that kind of presence has a way of illuminating things others would rather keep hidden. When someone carries unresolved insecurity, they often rely on distraction, denial, or comparison to maintain their sense of self. They build identities around appearances, achievements, or social positioning. But an empath doesn't engage at that level. They tune in to what's beneath it. They respond to tone, to microexpressions, to emotional inconsistencies, and without saying a word, they begin to reflect back what's actually there. That's where the tension begins, because when people feel seen beyond their constructed identity, it disrupts the narrative they've been telling themselves. It challenges the version of reality they've carefully maintained. And here's the key point: most individuals are not consciously prepared to confront that disruption. So instead of interpreting the empath's presence as insight or depth, they interpret it as a threat. Not an obvious threat, nothing overt. It's quieter than that. It shows up as subtle discomfort, a slight defensiveness, a feeling of being exposed without understanding why. And the mind, trying to resolve that discomfort, looks for a source. It lands on the empath. Now, instead of recognizing I feel insecure right now, the internal dialogue shifts to there's something about them I don't like. That's how projection works. The discomfort is real, but its origin is misidentified. And over time, that misidentification can evolve into resentment. What makes this more complex is that empaths are rarely confrontational in the traditional sense. They're not attacking anyone. They're not pointing fingers. In many cases, they're being supportive, even understanding. But their authenticity creates contrast, and contrast is powerful. It highlights the difference between what is real and what is performed. For someone who is grounded in their identity, that contrast can be inspiring. It can feel like permission to be more honest, more open. But for someone who is operating from insecurity, it can feel like judgment even when none is being expressed. So you end up with this paradox: the empath is offering presence and the other person experiences pressure. The empath is simply being, and the other person feels evaluated. Not because of anything the empath is doing wrong, but because of what their presence reveals. And here's where it becomes important for empaths to understand this dynamic. If you don't recognize what's happening, you may internalize the reaction. You may start to believe you've done something to deserve the distance, the coldness, or the subtle hostility. You might try to dim your light, soften your presence, or overcompensate to make others comfortable. But that's a miscalculation, because the issue was never your light, it was what your light exposed. When you understand that, your approach changes. You stop trying to manage other people's discomfort as if it's your responsibility. You become more discerning about where you invest your energy. And you begin to recognize that not everyone is meant to feel comfortable around truth, especially if they've spent years avoiding it. This isn't about becoming distant or guarded. It's about becoming aware. It's about recognizing that your presence will naturally filter people. Some will lean in, others will pull away. And that reaction tells you more about them than it does about you. So the question isn't whether your light makes others uncomfortable. It will. The real question is whether you're willing to keep it on anyway. Because the moment you start dimming it to ease someone else's insecurity is the moment you start losing clarity about who you are, and that's a cost far greater than their discomfort. There's another layer to this dynamic that doesn't get talked about enough, and it's not just about what empaths reveal and others, it's about what they give. Empaths don't just perceive deeply, they respond deeply. When they sense pain, confusion, or emotional need, their instinct is to move toward it, not away from it. They offer attention, reassurance, patience, and they do it without running a constant evaluation of whether it's being earned. At first glance, that sounds like a strength, and it is, but unfiltered giving has consequences, especially in a social environment where not everyone operates with the same level of awareness or integrity. When you consistently provide emotional support without requiring reciprocity, you create an imbalance, not intentionally, but inevitably. Some people will appreciate it, respect it, and even grow because of it, but others will adapt to it. They begin to rely on your presence as a resource rather than relating to you as an equal. And here's Where it becomes psychologically interesting. Human beings don't just respond to what they receive, they respond to the meaning they assign to it. When support is given freely and continuously, without boundaries or discernment, certain individuals begin to devalue it. Not consciously, but behaviorally. What was once appreciated becomes expected. What was once respected becomes normalized. Over time, the dynamic shifts. You're no longer seen as someone choosing to give, you're seen as someone whose role is to give. And when that role becomes part of the other person's internal model of the relationship, something subtle starts to happen. They stop asking whether they're contributing. They stop reflecting on their own behavior. The focus narrows to their needs, their emotions, their outcomes. Now, when an empath inevitably reaches a point of fatigue or clarity and begins to pull back, even slightly, it disrupts that model. The person who has grown accustomed to receiving without giving experiences that shift as a loss. But instead of examining the imbalance, they interpret it as a change in you. You've changed. You're not the same anymore. You used to care more. What they're really responding to is the removal of access, not the loss of connection. And that's where resentment starts to build. Because from their perspective, something they had come to depend on is no longer available in the same way. And instead of recognizing that it was never sustainable to begin with, they frame it as deprivation. The empath, who was once a source of comfort, becomes a source of frustration. There's also an underlying psychological tension here that's worth understanding. When someone receives more than they give over a prolonged period, it can create a quiet sense of inferiority, not always consciously acknowledged, but present. They know, on some level, that the exchange isn't equal. And rather than correcting that imbalance, it's often easier to diminish the person. Who's giving? If they can convince themselves that your support isn't that valuable, or that your presence isn't that rare, then they don't have to confront their own lack of contribution. That's how admiration quietly turns into dismissal and, eventually, resentment. For the empath, this can be confusing. You look at your behavior and see generosity, consistency, and care. You don't see exploitation because you weren't operating with that framework. But generosity without boundaries doesn't just attract people in need, it attracts people who are comfortable staying in need. So the shift that has to happen is not in your capacity to give, but in your willingness to evaluate where that giving is going. It's not about becoming less compassionate, it's about becoming more precise, more intentional, more aware of the difference between supporting growth and enabling stagnation. Because not everyone who receives your energy is using it to build something. Some are using it to avoid building anything at all. And once you recognize that, your behavior changes. You stop offering depth to people who are committed to staying shallow. You stop investing in dynamics that only function when you overextend. And you begin to understand that your empathy is not a resource to be consumed, it's a signal to be directed. So the question becomes very simple but very important. Are you giving because it creates growth or because it prevents discomfort? Because one builds connection and the other builds dependency. There's a third mechanism at play here, and it operates with a level of subtlety that most people never fully articulate. Empaths don't just sense emotions and respond to them, they reflect them. They act as mirrors, not in a performative way, but in a way that reveals emotional truth with very little distortion. And for someone who hasn't developed the capacity to face themselves honestly, that reflection can feel deeply unsettling. Most people move through life with a curated version of themselves, not necessarily a false identity, but an edited one. They emphasize certain traits, minimize others, and avoid confronting the contradictions that don't fit neatly into their self-image. This isn't malicious, it's protective. It's how people maintain psychological stability while navigating complex environments. But an empath interacts differently. They don't engage primarily with the curated version. They pick up on inconsistencies. They notice when words don't match tone, when expressions don't align with underlying emotion, when someone says they're fine but their behavior suggests otherwise. And again, they don't need to call it out directly. The recognition itself is enough. That's where the discomfort begins. Because when someone feels that their internal state has been accurately perceived, especially the parts they haven't accepted themselves, it creates a kind of cognitive friction. It challenges the gap between who they believe they are and what they're actually experiencing. And that gap is where a lot of psychological tension lives. Now, if a person is self-aware, that moment can be constructive. It can lead to reflection, adjustment, growth. But if they're not ready for that level of honesty, the mind looks for a way to reduce the tension without changing the self-image. And one of the fastest ways to do that is to reject the mirror. So instead of thinking, maybe there's something here I need to look at, the reaction becomes, there's something about this person that makes me uncomfortable. Again, the feeling is real, but the interpretation is off. What's particularly interesting is that this dynamic doesn't require the empath to say anything explicit. In fact, it often happens in silence. A pause that lasts a little too long, a look that lingers, a response that feels slightly more attuned than expected. These micro-interactions communicate awareness. And awareness, when it's directed at someone who isn't used to being seen clearly, can feel invasive even when it's not intended that way. Over time, that discomfort can evolve. It doesn't usually stay as confusion. The brain doesn't like unresolved tension, so it organizes it into a more stable narrative. And that narrative often positions the empath as the source of the problem. They're too intense. They're hard to read. They make me feel judged. Notice the pattern. The language shifts from internal experience to external blame. The empath isn't just someone who notices, they become someone who is perceived as causing the discomfort. And here's where resentment starts to take shape. Because once someone believes that another person is responsible for how they feel, especially in a negative way, distance isn't always enough. There's often a need to justify that feeling, to reinforce it. That can show up as subtle criticism, passive-aggressive behavior, or even attempts to undermine the empath's credibility or intentions. From the empath's perspective, this can feel confusing, even disorienting. You haven't attacked, accused, or confronted yet. The response you're getting suggests conflict. And without understanding the underlying mechanism, it's easy to question your own behavior. You might wonder if you're being too much, too perceptive, too present. But what's actually happening is much more structural. You're reflecting something that hasn't been processed. And instead of being integrated, it's being externalized. This is why it becomes critical for empaths to develop a certain level of detachment, not emotional distance, but cognitive clarity. You have to recognize when you're being cast into a role that doesn't belong to you. You are not responsible for how someone reacts to being seen. You're not accountable for the discomfort that arises when illusion meets clarity. At the same time, this awareness doesn't mean you become indifferent. It means you become selective. You start to notice who is capable of engaging with that reflection in a constructive way and who consistently deflects it. You adjust your level of depth accordingly, not as a form of withdrawal, but as a form of precision. Because reflection, when it's received properly, is one of the most valuable forms of connection. It creates alignment. It fosters honesty. It allows people to move beyond surface-level interaction into something more real. But when it's resisted, it becomes a source of tension that can't be resolved externally. So the key insight here is simple, but not always easy to accept. When someone resents you for what you reflect, they're not reacting to you, they're reacting to what they're not ready to face. And that leaves you with a decision. You can either distort the reflection to make it more comfortable, or you can keep it clear and let people decide whether they're willing to see themselves in it. Because a mirror doesn't create the image, it only reveals it. There's another pattern that tends to show up in the development of empaths, and it has less to do with what they feel and more to do with what they tolerate. Most empaths don't start out with strong boundaries. In fact, their sensitivity often leads them in the opposite direction. They learn early sometimes without realizing it that harmony is maintained by accommodating others, by anticipating needs, by minimizing conflict before it even surfaces. That skill set can be incredibly effective in certain environments. It allows them to navigate emotionally complex situations with precision. But there's a trade-off. When you become highly attuned to others without being equally anchored in your own limits, you become a source of support and guidance for others. You create a pattern where your internal boundaries are flexible, but other people's expectations are not. And over time, that imbalance becomes your baseline. People begin to understand, consciously or not, that you're the one who will adjust. You're the one who will absorb tension. Smooth over discomfort, extend patience beyond what's typical. And because this pattern develops gradually, it rarely feels like a clear violation. It just feels like who you are. But here's where it shifts. At some point, usually through repeated experiences, the empath starts to recognize the cost. Not intellectually at first, but physically, emotionally. There's fatigue. There's a sense of depletion that doesn't resolve with rest. There's a growing awareness that something about the exchange isn't sustainable. And that's when boundaries begin to form. Not as a reaction, but as a correction. A recalibration of what is acceptable, what is reciprocal, what is actually aligned with your well-being. And when that shift happens, it changes the structure of every relationship that was built on the previous version of you. Now, this is where most people expect understanding. After all, you're not asking for anything unreasonable. You're not withdrawing entirely. You're simply adjusting the terms of engagement to something more balanced. But that's not how it's experienced on the other side, because the people who benefited most from your lack of boundaries didn't interpret it as a lack. They interpreted it as access, as consistency, as something they could rely on without question. So when that access changes even slightly, it doesn't register as growth, it registers as loss. And loss, especially when it's not anticipated, often leads to resistance. You've become distant. You're harder to talk to. You're not as supportive as you used to be. Again, notice the framing. The focus isn't on the relationship becoming more balanced. It's on the deviation from what was previously available. And underlying that is an assumption that the earlier version of you was the correct one. But that assumption ignores something critical. The earlier version of you was unsustainable. What you're witnessing in these moments is not just disagreement, it's the exposure of a dynamic. That only functioned under specific conditions. Conditions where your needs were secondary, where your limits were undefined, where your role was to maintain stability at your own expense. And when you remove those conditions, the dynamic either adapts or it breaks. Now, for individuals who are capable of self-reflection, this transition can lead to healthier interaction. They may question their own expectations. They may adjust their behavior. They may recognize that what felt normal wasn't necessarily fair. But for others, the reaction moves in a different direction. Instead of adapting, they reinterpret your boundaries as rejection. And from that interpretation, resentment begins to form. Because in their view, you didn't just change, you took something away. What they don't see is that what you took away was never meant to be permanent in the first place. It was an overextension, not a standard. It was a phase of learning, not a fixed identity. For the empath, this is a critical point of clarity. If you don't understand this process, you may feel pressure to revert, to go back to what was familiar, even if it was draining. You may question whether your boundaries are too rigid, too sudden, too much. But the reality is, boundaries don't create dysfunction, they reveal it. They show you which relationships were built on mutual respect and which were built on silent compromise. They expose where balance exists and where it was assumed, but never actually present. And that information, while sometimes uncomfortable, is essential. Because without it, you remain in patterns that slowly erode your sense of self under the guise of connection. So the goal isn't to avoid the tension that comes with setting boundaries. The goal is to understand what that tension is telling you. It's feedback. It's data. It's a signal that the structure of the relationship is being tested against a new standard. And not every structure will hold. So the question you have to ask yourself is not whether your boundaries will upset people, they will. The real question is whether you're willing to maintain them long enough to see which relationships can actually meet you there. Because the moment you stop protecting your limits is the moment you start negotiating your worth. There's another dynamic that begins to emerge as empaths become more grounded in themselves, and it's less about what they do and more about how they exist. When an empath develops a sense of internal stability, when they're no longer reacting to every emotional signal, when they're no longer trying to fix or absorb everything around them, they start to operate from a place of calm. Not passivity, not detachment, but clarity. And that kind of calm has a very specific effect on certain people. Because not everyone is comfortable in stillness. For some, their entire sense of identity is built around movement, around stimulation, conflict, urgency. They're used to environments where emotions are heightened, where problems are constant, where there's always something to respond to. It creates a kind of psychological momentum. It feels familiar. It feels normal. So when they encounter someone who isn't participating in that pattern, someone who isn't escalating, isn't reacting, isn't feeding into the same cycles, it disrupts that momentum. At first, it might just feel like a mismatch. a difference in energy. But over time, it can start to feel more personal because calm, when it's consistent, becomes a form of contrast. It highlights the volatility in others without directly addressing it. It shows by example that there's another way to operate, one that doesn't rely on constant external stimulation or emotional fluctuation. And for someone who hasn't developed that internal stability, that contrast can be difficult to sit with. Not because it's wrong, but because it's unfamiliar. And unfamiliar states often get interpreted as uncomfortable ones. So instead of recognizing the calm as something to learn from, it's perceived as something to challenge. You might notice subtle attempts to pull you back into reactivity, small provocations, comments designed to get a response, situations that seem unnecessarily complicated or emotionally charged. It's not always intentional. In many cases, it's an unconscious attempt to restore a familiar dynamic. If they can get you to react the way others do, then the contrast disappears. The environment feels predictable again. But when you don't engage, when you maintain that sense of composure, it creates a kind of friction because now they're faced with a state they can't easily influence. And that lack of control can lead to frustration. Over time, that frustration can shift into something more defined. It can become a narrative. They're too detached. They don't care enough. They think they're better than everyone else. Again, the pattern repeats. The internal discomfort gets externalized. The calm that was once neutral becomes interpreted as negative. Not because of what it is, but because of what it represents. It represents self-regulation. It represents independence from emotional chaos. It represents a level of internal order that isn't easily disrupted. And for someone who is still operating in a more reactive state, that can feel inaccessible. Now, here's where it becomes important for empaths to stay grounded in their understanding of this dynamic. Because if you're not clear on what's happening, it's easy to misinterpret these reactions. You might start to question whether you're being too distant, too reserved, too disconnected. You might feel pressure to meet people where they are by lowering your level of stability, by engaging in patterns you've already moved beyond. But that's not alignment, that's regression. There's a difference between being present with someone and being pulled into their pattern. One is intentional, the other is reactive. And maintaining that distinction is what allows you to stay centered without becoming isolated. Because the goal isn't to avoid people who operate differently. It's to engage without losing your structure. To be able to enter a chaotic environment without becoming chaotic yourself. To be able to respond without absorbing, to be able to remain steady, even when the external conditions are not. That kind of presence does something over time. It filters your environment. Some people will resist it, as we've discussed, but others will begin to adjust to it. They'll recognize that the interaction feels different, more stable, more predictable, less draining. And those are the relationships that tend to evolve in a more sustainable direction. So what you start to see is a division, not one you create intentionally, but one that emerges naturally. People either align with that stability or they move away from it. And that's not a failure of connection. It's a refinement of it. Because not every dynamic is meant to be maintained at every stage of your development. Some are only compatible with earlier versions of you versions that operated under different conditions, different tolerances, different levels of awareness. And as those conditions change, so does the compatibility. So the presence, you cultivate your calm, your clarity, your restraint. It's not just a personal achievement. It's a signal. It communicates what kind of interaction you're available for and what kind you're no longer participating in. And people will respond to that signal in different ways. Some will see it as distance. Others will see it as strength. But the interpretation doesn't change the function. Because calm doesn't create chaos, it reveals who depends on it. And the moment you understand that is the moment you stop trying to explain your stability to people who are unsettled by it.